Okay, so welcome to Earthworms for Farmers, which is an Enter-Learn webinar looking into earthworm soil processes and agriculture. And it's designed to give people that maybe don't have a scientific background in earthworms a bit of an introduction to earthworms. What we're going to go through today is we're going to start with what is an earthworm to make sure we're all on the same page. And then we're going to go through the different types of earthworm, and I'll explain what I mean by type of earthworm when we get to that part. And then I'm going to introduce some soil processes and ecosystem services that are relevant to earthworms before talking about earthworms in agriculture, which will include some of the threats that agriculture may pose to earthworms and some of the ways that we can, some of the better agricultural practices that we can undertake for our earthworm populations. And then I'm going to end with how we can improve our understanding of earthworms. So let's move on to what is an earthworm. So I like to start off with the dictionary definition because it really, I think it helps rather than going into really complex taxonomy, etc. And if we break up the words earth and worm, the word earth can mean a number of things, but in this case, we're really looking at the second definition, which is the substance of the land surface, the soil. And the second half of the word worm, we're looking at the first definition, any number of creeping or burrowing invertebrate animals with long, slender, soft bodies and no limbs. So that's a fairly good description of what an earthworm looks like. And where it can be found. Now, earthworm itself is a word, and if you look that up in the dictionary, you'll see it will say a burrowing annelid worm that lives in the soil, important in aerating and draining the soil and in burying organic matter. So that term annelid, what does that mean? Well, I think it's important to understand where earthworms fit in the tree of life. And earthworms belong to this group called the annelid worms, or annelida is the scientific term. So these are all the segmented worms. So if you find a worm and it doesn't have segments, it's not an annelid. If you find a worm and it does have segments, then it is an annelid. It's that simple. Now, the annelids break down into two different, well, this is all simplified to be honest, but broadly speaking, they break down into two groups, the polychaeta, which are otherwise known as bristle worms, and they include things like lugworms and ragworms that you find on the beach, and many other marine species, including the bobbit worm or sand striker that comes out of the sediment and grabs fish and other things. It's a predator. And it also includes the clitellata. Now that term clitellata comes from the fact that these animals have a clitellum, which we more commonly know as the saddle. So the saddle is the fleshy band that you get on an earthworm. The clitellata breaks up into the leeches, the Hirudinea, very different from earthworms in terms of their diet and the way and their teeth, the fact that they have some. And you've got a number of different groups within there. And then you've got the oligochaetes. Now, the oligochaetes are the biggest, most diverse part of the annelids. They include lots of things that live in the water, in freshwater and in marine environments. A few things that live on land as well. But the thing that we're interested in is the Cresciclitellata. And we can see there that over 5,000 species have been described science to date. In the UK, though, we only have 3 families, and 2 of those families have just a single species, and those 2 families, the Acanthrodrilidae and the Sparganophilidae, that have a single representative, are actually not native to the UK. So these are earthworms that have been imported, probably through importing soils. Neither of them are very common. Neither of them pose any threats that we're aware of to our species. In fact, around the world, it's actually the species that we have natively here that cause more of a problem abroad. But the rest of our species all belong to Lumbricidae. So in Great Britain, we have 30 species of earthworm. So apart from the two that I mentioned, that represent one each from those two families, the other 28 are all from the Lumbricidae family, which is a family of earthworms that's native to not just Great Britain, but Europe. Right, so that's what an earthworm is. What we're going to talk about today, though, is more about the importance of earthworms. And one gentleman really hit the nail on the head. He was a famous biologist. You may have heard of him, Charles Darwin. And he is famous to me specifically for his amazing book, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. Not that other book that everybody knows about. And Darwin said that worms have played a more important part in the history of the world than most persons would at first suppose. And what I want to do today is take you on a little journey to understand how and why earthworms play an important part in the world. Because what we tend to do is quite often group all our earthworms together as one and say, earthworms are important, earthworms do this, earthworms do that. But we really need to think about the different types of earthworm and what they do to really understand why they're important and what the true threats to them are and how we can mitigate for that as well. So that brings us on to the types of earthworms. So I've mentioned that there's 30 different species in Great Britain, 28 of which we would consider to be native. And those earthworms can be broadly broken down into different ecological categories. Now, in reality, the groupings that I'm going to give you are a simplified version of what the reality is, because unfortunately nature never plays by simple rules that we set out, and I'll kind of go into this a little bit later, but for the purpose of this talk I'm going to break them down into 3 broad categories, and I'm going to do that based on their morphology, so how they look, and their ecology. So on this diagram here, the 3 that I'm going to talk about are the epigeic, which you can see in the top there, the endogeic, which you can see in the top layer of the soil, and these big ones here, the anisic. So the important thing here is that they're not all found in the same place. They're not all found in the soil, for example, and they're not all found at the same level, and they look different as well. So if we start with the anisic earthworms, these are the deep burrowing earthworms, and they live in vertical burrows that can go quite deep. They surface at night to feed and mate, which is why in America, our biggest species, the lobworm, it's known in America as the night crawler because it comes out at night to feed on leaves and to mate with other earthworms. As I just mentioned, they feed on leaves, but they'll also feed on the soil that's deep in the soil profile as well. And they'll burrow all through the soil profile. So within their guts, that they're mixing all that up. Now, color-wise, they have pigment. It's quite strong at the head end, much weaker at the tail end. So they have this deep red, black, purpley color at the head end, and they're often lighter at the tail end. They'll quite often flatten their tails as well. And they're really quite large in size. So we can be looking at up to 40 centimeters length in the UK. When I talk about lengths, I'm talking about length of a preserved earthworm, because measuring a live earthworm can be quite tricky, as you can imagine, because they can double in length, no problem. So how deep does an anisic earthworm burrow? Well, it varies. So because their burrows are vertical, they can be found at all depths within that. And they might be nearer the surface at certain times of year and further down at other times of year. But the one thing I want to take away from this diagram here, so this is from an experiment where monthly soil samples were taken in 1953, and the position of earthworms were measured for a number of different species. So these are 3 anisic species on here. And what we can see is that they do vary where they are, but they're quite often going down deeper. And if we look at the top 2 species, yeah, they're being found at all sorts of levels throughout the year. I think that September must have been quite dry, because we can see that the Lumbricus terrestris has gone down quite deep, and that's probably to avoid the drought conditions, and it's maybe having doing what we call estivating, where it will go into a state of torpor and try and sleep out the tough conditions. But they can go down much deeper than you can see on this, several meters, in fact, even some of our biggest species. So, as I mentioned, in America, the lobworm is referred to as the night crawler. And what they will do is they'll feed on leaves, they'll pull them into their burrows, where they'll feed on them, where it's much safer. And they come out at night, because obviously that's much safer, they're much less likely to get predated. You can see here some leaves sticking out and some earthworm poop, which we refer to as earthworm casts. And that's forming what we call a midden. So if you see these structures on the soil, that is a telltale sign that you've got anisic earthworms, particularly the lobworm there. And just in case you can't see them, there's one there, there's one there, one there, one there. And they'll build these with all sorts of things, little stones, twigs and sticks, leaves, and their casts, their poo as well. Now, not all anisic species will make these middens. Some will cast on the surface. So you're probably all familiar with these spirally type earthworm poos, which we refer to as earthworm casts. They're another sign of the anisic earthworms, and they'll do this at their burrow, at the end, out the mouth of their burrow. So moving down through the soil, up through the soil profile, sorry. So we started with the deep earthworms. We've then got the endogeic earthworms. So these are the shallow burrowing earthworms, and these live in horizontal burrows in the upper soil layers. They rarely come to the surface. They feed almost exclusively on soil. So they're just munching through that top soil where they live. And they're often really pale in colour. So they look quite different to the anisic earthworms in terms of colour. Size, they can be pretty much any size. You can get them quite small. And some of the biggest ones can give the even the big anisics a bit of a run for their money. They can be quite large. How deep do endogeic earthworms go? Again, what you'll see here is that it varies. So it's from the same experiment, again, looking at 3 species, but we can see that they're more commonly found in those top 7.5 centimeters of the soil. So they're really out there. They're spending more time in the top soil. They're going down a bit deeper in the deep winter and in the height of summer. And that's because the environmental variables are not ideal. So if there's frosts or if there's drought conditions, they'll go down a bit deeper to avoid that. But when conditions are great for them to be doing their thing, they'll be in those top layers of the soil. So yeah, shallow burrowers, as we can see here. So these ones here, these ill-looking earthworms will all be anisic, endogeic earthworms. So then we move on, we go above ground now and we look at the epigeic earthworms. Now, superficially, this looks very like an anisic earthworm, but what you can't tell from this image is that this earthworm would be a lot smaller. There can be overlap. The largest adult epigeic can be bigger than the smallest anisic, so it's not always the best measure, and it can make categorizing them quite hard if you're not actually looking at species. But they have that same pigmentation. They're quite often and not quite as pale at the tail end. This one is, but quite often they can be quite a deep red colour all the way across. They live in the leaflet of the dung, the deadwood, whatever decaying plant material or animal waste material that they're feeding on, they live within. So they live within their food substrate. Usually found on the surface, feed on decaying plant matter such as leaflet and rotten logs. They include the stripy ones as well that you get in compost bins. And like I said, often small in size, although some of the compost ones can be a bit bigger. And as you'll see here, this is a epigeic earthworm that's been found living within dead wood. So not an earthworm that's not in the earth. Right, okay, so now we know about our different types of earthworm. I wanted to have a think about what they might be doing in the ground. So in order to do that, I wanted to explore some of the soil processes that earthworms might be involved in. So when we're thinking about soil formation, soil processes, there are 4 different types of soil processes that we want to think about. And the first is addition. So this is when things are added to the soil. So examples of this would include leaf litter falling to the ground that's being added to the top layers of the soil. It could also be mineral deposits as well. So a landslide could add things to the top of the soil profile as well. Second type of soil processes we've got are translocations. So translocations are when soil is moved around within the soil profile. So I should have probably said it with number 1, the additions. An example of adding things to the soil would be the breakdown of leaves by earthworms. Translocations might be earthworms moving soil either by but it could be by burrowing or by just sticking to them as they move through the soil. The third kind of soil processes are the transformations. So this is when components of the soil are converted from one thing to another. So an example here might be certain minerals being converted, or certain chemicals being converted into certain minerals, which earthworms will be involved with through consuming and consuming soil and then pooping it out in a different form. And then finally there's losses. So losses are when soil might leach through the bottom of the system, for example, when rainwater washes through and takes out the system as well. So these are the different types of soil processes that inform how our soil is formed and how it's structured. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the kinds of soil processes that earthworms are involved with. So starting off, one of the first things, one of the most obvious, is decomposition. So earthworms, we all know that earthworms are involved in decomposition. I think people state that quite a lot, but are all earthworms involved in decomposition in the same way? And the answer is no. Our different ecological categories do help decompose different parts of the soil. So if we think first of all about our epigeic earthworms, those surface-dwelling earthworms are helping to decompose the leaf litter, but also any other decaying plant material like dead wood, animal waste like animal dung, etc. So they're feeding on that, and then they're pooping it out as earthworm casts, and that's helping to decompose it. It's then those casts then become part of the topsoil, and that topsoil, those top layers of the soil, are all it's been fed on by the endogeic earthworms. So they're breaking down that soil even further. They're feeding on that soil, they're decomposing it further, and they're contributing to decomposition within the soil profile in a slightly different way. And then finally, you've got the anesic earthworms, which are also feeding on the leaf litter as well, but they're also feeding on soil from the whole profile, including the really nutrient poor soil deep down in the profile. And that's all been mixed up inside their gut and then pooped out as their earthworm casts. So when we delve in things a little deeper, we can see that it's not just a simple case of earthworms are involved in decomposition. Our different types of earthworm are involved in different parts of the decomposition cycle. So another soil process that they're involved in is organic matter and nutrient cycle. So they consume, digest, and redistribute organic matter. So They help break down organic matter, as we've talked about in the decomposition, but they're also moving it about. And they're moving it sideways through the soil profile, they're moving it up and down through the soil profile, and they're digesting it because they're eating the soil as well. So they promote microbial activity, accelerating the organic matter breakdown as well. So it's not just them breaking it down through their gut, but within their gut, when they're feeding on it, there's lots of beneficial microbes that are being added to that are helping it to break down even faster. And the mucus that they give off also helps promote this as well. In terms of in terms of the chemistry as well, they also reduce the ratio of carbon to nitrogen organic matter as well. And that, clicked on the wrong thing. That means that most nitrogen is converted into nitrate or ammonium form. And what that means is nitrogen can't be taken up by plants, but when it's converted into a nitrate or ammonium form, it's then available to plants to use. So they're making chemicals more available to plants. And the same can be said for things like potassium and phosphorus as well. So if you've got earthworms toiling away in your soil, they're going to make chemicals that would otherwise be unavailable to plants that are needed by plants. They're going to convert them into an available form. So another soil process that they're involved in is what we call soil pore creation. Now, we've talked about those deep burrowing earthworms that have those vertical burrows. So this is really good for allowing aeration and drainage into the soil. Vertical burrows, great, but you've also got these horizontal burrows from the endogeic earthworms as well. So it's that whole combination of those burrow systems that are creating, it's all one combined effect. So the soil systems would be nowhere near as aerated and well drained if it wasn't for earthworms. And finally, the earthworms are really important for what we call soil aggregate formation. So if we think about a sandy soil, it's just lots of individual particles. And we all know that the sandy soils have very little structure. You can't mold them into shapes or anything like that. They don't stick together. They also water drains through them very quickly as well, so they don't hold water very well either. And a lot of plants would struggle to grow in very, very sandy soils as well. So soil aggregates are when individual soil particles stick together, and they stick together because of organic matter and fertilizers, etc. So the mucus from earthworms and the things that are added while they're eating them as well help these soil aggregates form. And as they ingest them, mix them, and create water stable aggregates, this really improves the structure of the soil. It's been estimated that up to 50% of the aggregates in the upper soil layers are actually due to earthworm activity. So without them, we would have very different soils. And it's important, again, to note that not all of the different ecological groupings of earthworms are going to do a contribute in the same way. So arenetic earthworms, our epigeic earthworms, our endogeic earthworms, and the way that they cast contributes in different ways to soil aggregate formation. So we've talked about some of the soil processes that we're involved with. I just want to introduce a term here called ecosystem engineers. So why are earthworms really, really important vital organisms within a healthy soil ecosystem? It's because they are an ecosystem engineer. And an ecosystem engineer is any organism that directly or indirectly modulates the availability of resources to create its own environment or habitat. So some really obvious examples in the animal world would be beavers. Beavers will dam up trickles of water so that they create this wetland habitat, which is perfect for them. So that you don't get beaver habitat unless you've got beavers, essentially. Examples in the plant world are much more numerous, actually, because plants quite often are ecosystem engineers, but some really clear ones would be trees. You don't get a woodland without trees, and sphagnum moss, because you wouldn't get a sphagnum bog without sphagnum. Earthworms are less obvious because they're below ground and we don't see what they're doing, but earthworms are creating that habitat from the ground up. So they are ecosystem engineers, just hidden away a little bit more. So I want to return to those three ecological categories that we talked about, and I want to think about those soil processes and look at how different types of earthworm contribute to different ecosystem services. So if we go, first of all, to the epigeic earthworm, so where you've got a black box around something, I'm trying to highlight that there's a really significant impact there. So epigeic earthworms, those surface-dwelling ones that feed on leaf litter, they contribute to a number of soil processes, so decomposition, nutrient cycling, and soil pore creation, but they contribute a lot more to decomposition. And one of the main ecosystem service that comes out of that is waste recycling and detoxification of the soils. If we then look at the anesic earthworms, they contribute to all four of the soil processes that we've talked about, but in particular, they're having a big impact on soil pore creation. And the ecosystem service that is really contributing to is water flow regulation, as well as aeration as well of the soil. So anesic earthworms very important for that. And then with the endogeic earthworms, these are the shallow burrowing earthworms that eat mainly the soil as they're burrowing through. They're really important for soil aggregate formation. So they're creating that soil structure maintenance that we need for healthy soils. Where the true magic happens, though, is when we combine all of those earthworms, those different types of earthworms, and we look at the soil processes and we look at the ecosystem services. So combined, the impact of our earthworm populations is huge on the soil processes and the ecosystem services that they provide. So something that we've not talked so much about there is carbon and nutrient regulation, because no one of those earthworm categories is having this major significant impact on that, but when you combine it all together, they are. So earthworms, different types, important for different soil processes and the resulting ecosystem services to different degrees, but when you combine it all together, really, really important for all of them combined. And you'll see at the end of the ecosystem services there's a thing, everything leads to what we call biomass production. And something that I think is always worth mentioning is that earthworms are a really dominant biomass within the soil. They're an important food source for many other organisms. So I've got some vertebrates here, but they're important for a lot of invertebrates as well, including their cousins, the leeches. So leeches will eat them. But yeah, all of our garden birds and our farmland birds, there's a lot of those where earthworms will be a really significant component of their diet. There have been studies on badgers that have shown how important the lobworm in particular is to their diet. Moles, which I know not everybody's a fan of, but where would our moles be if we didn't have earthworms? Amphibians, reptiles, everyone's most beloved mammal, the hedgehog. All of these animals would really struggle if it wasn't for earthworms to feed on. So what I have got one stat here for you. So UK soils can contain between 53,000 and 160,000 earthworms per acre, which is the equivalent of 10 to 400 earthworms per metre squared. Something I want to point, a couple of things I want to point out here. First of all, these numbers are huge. I mean, that means that earthworms really are a dominant biomass in the soil. So it's no wonder that they're so important. But secondly, there's a lot of variation there. And that is something that is really important to consider when looking at earthworms in soils. Like, earthworm populations can be really patchy, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the earthworm population isn't healthy. The number of earthworms that you have within a square meter of soil can be heavily dependent on things like environmental conditions, soil moisture, and that itself can be extremely variable, even within a single field. Right, okay, moving on. Earthworms and agriculture. So what I'm going to do here is just go through a number of things, agricultural practices that may damage earthworm populations, and some of the potential mitigating measures that we can put in place for them. So it may be no surprise to anyone that ploughing can potentially damage our earthworm populations. Now, again, it's important to consider those different ecological categories, because it actually, the effect of ploughing has a differing impact depending on what type of earthworm it is. So it's particularly damaging to epigeic, so those surface dwelling, and anethic, those vertical burrowing larger earthworms. And what I didn't mention earlier is those vertical burrows are permanent burrow structures, so they're permanent homes for the earthworms. So yeah, it's no surprise that the damage to those burrows is going to have a more significant impact on those earthworms. The bigger the earthworm as well, quite often the longer lived as well. So what can we do to minimize the impact of ploughing? Well, something that is becoming more and more popular is no-till. So reducing the soil disturbance using a direct drill to plant crops is obviously going to be less damaging to earthworm populations. And there have been studies showing that no-till methods lead to increased earthworm diversity within the soil as well. So where possible, applying a no-till method to managing your crops is always preferable. So another threat, if you will, to earthworms are monocultures, or maybe not even just monocultures, but having large swaths of land where it's all the same. So a lack of diversity in the landscape is likely to support a lower diversity of earthworm species. So I've talked about the different ecological categories of earthworms, but we have 30 different species in the UK. So there are going to be variations within those categories as well. There's going to be certain preferences, microhabitats that different species go for. So the more varied a habitat, the more diversity of earthworms that you're going to have. And the more diversity of earthworms that you're going to have, the healthier the soil systems that you're going to have. So what can we do to improve the landscape for earthworms? We can make sure that we've got healthy hedgerows along the margins of our fields. So a healthy hedgerow can allow recolonization into fields. You do get species of earthworm associated with hedgerows in particular as well. So it will definitely help with that diversity. And something that's becoming more and more popular is agroforestry, so planting strips of trees. And this enables more microhabitats for earthworms to survive in. So you do actually get earthworms living in trees. You get them living in rot holes and things like that. But the leaf litter is really, really vital. So monocultures, where there's a lack of leaf litter, where that crop is being taken away, means that there's less for the earthworms to feed on, which is why we need to put fertilizers on those fields. So agroforestry allows a system where that is being recycled back in, so it helps the earthworms as well. So pesticides, it's going to come as no surprise to anybody that pesticides or the addition of chemicals can be damaging to our earthworms. It's important to consider why, though. A pesticide doesn't have to kill earthworms to be harmful to earthworms or to be harmful to agricultural ecosystems. So any pesticides that kill earthworms are obviously going to do instant damage to soil health because the earthworm populations are going to perish. However, in addition to that, earthworm populations can be disadvantaged by pesticides because they can affect the health of the earthworm. So you don't need to kill an earthworm to make it less effective. You can deteriorate its health, or it could affect its ability to reproduce. Or so there's those factors, but there's also the fact that some earthworms can act as reservoirs for toxins as well. So if you've got, we've talked about how earthworms are an important food source for many other animals. If you've got birds that are eating lots of earthworms each day, and each earthworm is chock full of certain chemicals that could be toxic to the bird, then eventually you're going to get bioaccumulation, a buildup of that toxin within the bird system, and it can die from eating the earthworms that are full of those chemicals. So it's really important that we think about what chemicals we're putting into the soil. And one point I'd just really like to make clear here is that chemicals that are put on plants to kill pollinators, for example, will end up in the soil because they will get washed into the soil and water and freshwater systems as well through rain. And there have been studies that have shown that the impacts of neonicotinoids, for example, are more severe on soil invertebrates than they are on pollinators. And pollinators get all of the press, fluffy bees get all of the attention, but quite often the impact on the soil invertebrates can be much more damaging than even the pollinators. Another type of chemical that I just want to raise awareness of are veterinary drugs. So what we put into our cattle inevitably ends up on the surface of the field. So as an example, ivermectin, which is for worming, can be deposited by cows, either by them directly pooing on the field, or where slurry is spread over a field. So where animals have been treated for this, there is the potential for this to have an impact on the soil invertebrates, such as the earthworms. And anecdotally, what I can tell you is when I go earthworm surveying, I find that cow pats are either full of life or devoid of life. And it really does seem to be one or the other. And my instinct is that is probably to do with something that the cows have been treated with. So going for more nature-friendly worming solutions is the obvious mitigation for that. Another thing that I just want to raise awareness of are invasive flatworms. So you may well have heard of the New Zealand flatworm, and if you're in the southwest, you may well have heard of the Australian flatworm. So these are two species of flatworm that are not native to the UK. I'm not going to patronize you about telling you where they're respectively from, because it's quite obvious from the names. And these are established threats. We're not going to get rid of these now. They are here to stay, and they predate our native earthworms. And I believe they predate different types of earthworm as well. I've heard anecdotally in Scotland from recorders of mine that when they look under stones, or they don't find the big earthworms anymore, they just find the New Zealand flatworm. And where you get the Australian flatworm, which it can be common in the southwest, you get it in really big numbers. So you never just find one, you find it in quite big numbers. So these are things that we know are impacting our earthworms already. We don't know how big that impact is. But they're not the only threats. The Obama flatworm is a flatworm from Brazil that also eats earthworms, and that has been recorded from a number of instances in the UK. I think it's been found from pot plants that have been brought into the UK. The big threat, though, is the New Guinea flatworm. It's a really big problem on the continent. It eats earthworms, and that is something that we believe will be here sooner rather than later. It's probably inevitable. How can we combat this? Better biosecurity is the easiest answer, but in reality, what we can all do to at least keep aware of what's going on is report flatworms. So Bug Life have a flatworm recording form on their website, so you can use that, or you can submit your records to iRecord. But it's just really important that those records go somewhere, otherwise we don't know about the problem until it's too late. If you give detail, if you found that flatworms on a potted plant, then give details of where that potted plant come from, so that the correct interventions can be put in place to make sure that that doesn't become an infection point that's spreading flatworms to the surrounding area. So how can we improve our understanding of earthworms? So if you want to hear more about earthworm research and agriculture, there's a fantastic talk by Professor Mark Hodson called "Can You Use Earthworms to Indicate Healthy Soil Distribution and Sampling?" And I hosted this back when I worked for the Field Studies Council. The link's just gone in the chat. And he will talk a lot more about ecotoxicology and how you can measure, whether you can measure earthworms to indicate healthy soil. Now, a caveat that I'm going to put in there is that Mark talks about using the different ecological categories. And I personally believe that we need to think more about recording the species that we've got. So this is a map of all of the peacock butterfly in 2009, produced by Butterfly Conservation. And it shows 1995 to 99 time period and the 2005 to 2009 time period, where you've got new records. So we've got enough information there to see that the peacock butterfly is increasing its range. In 2009, the same time, this is a map of all species of earthworms. And you can see our coverage with earthworms is really, really lacking. So one of the things that's really holding us back with using earthworms as indicators of healthy soils or understanding what's happening with our populations is a lack of data. A lot of data that we do have is actually from agricultural research. And oh, is it there? Did I take it out? Took out the picture. So I've been working with an earthworm researcher, Frank Ashwood, at Forest Research, to look at where our evidence gaps are. And we'll have a paper coming out in the not too distant future that looks at which habitats and which sampling methods have been surveyed in detail or not so much. So on this figure here, the deeper purple, the more well represented that is within the data set. So we can see here that although farmland is quite well represented, there are still some things like deadwood, turning over deadwood in farmland that we know very little about. So there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, particularly outside of agriculture. Another thing that I want to raise awareness of, I mentioned these three ecological categories. The truth is it's much more complicated than that, and there are intermediate categories as well. And I'm working with Emma Sherlock at the Natural History Museum to look at how we better categorize the British and Irish species. And there'll be something coming out in the next few years about that as well. And I'm also working for Natural England at the moment on a provisional conservation estate assessment of the UK earthworms, so that we can say more about whether specific species are threatened or not. So that's something that I'll be coming back to. I'll be releasing in the not too distant future. If you want to know more about earthworms, there's just a link going in the chat now about where to sign up to the free National Earthworm Recording Scheme Bulletin. And on that note, I'm going to stop the recording